Hello, family members. I hope you're having a nice day today. I want to talk to you today about something that I think I've thought about a lot. And it's really, it's hard to speak about other people's faith. I was raised Methodist, still a member of my childhood Methodist church, although that's in West Virginia and I'm in Florida, so I do occasionally watch the live stream on YouTube of the sermons or the choirs or whatever, but I don't go to church anymore. I don't go anywhere anymore, actually, so. Anyway, I have been watching how since before I was born, shortly before I was born, just in the decades before I was born, a concerted effort was made to commodify Christianity in the United States to use for political gain. Issues were made political that didn't used to be considered political. And it became something that a preacher would encourage from a pulpit to vote for a certain person or different. Here's the thing. It's one thing for a preacher to encourage their community to vote. It's an entirely different thing for a preacher to, advocate voting for a specific party. I mean, very rarely is that going to be the right thing to do. Now, when they're not at the pulpit, when they're in their own personal lives, that's a little different. But from the pulpit, with the authority of the church, that's a little concerning. Anyway, I was raised in a really great church environment. I have a very strong faith. I pray every night before I go to sleep. I pray every time I hear a police or fire siren. I pray for the first responders and anyone they're helping. That was something that a preacher of mine when I was a little girl said that he did that, and I thought that makes sense. I like that. And I pray when I watch the news. I pray whenever I see people put prayer requests on social media. I don't believe in evangelizing. I really don't. I think that in the society that we live in, the best thing you can do is witness by your faith. Live by your faith. Be unapologetic about it. And by virtue of the fact that what you're doing is good and people around you can see that, it will make them feel positively towards God and religion, and maybe make them more interested in exploring that spiritual side of themselves if they are interested in that sort of thing. And if they're not, that's fine too. To me, it's like being a Christian is a total way of life that involves charity, kindness, understanding, loving everyone and everything. Kindness, community. That's Christianity to me. And I've watched these non-denominational, mostly, independent, often mega churches pop up that preach an interpretation of the Bible that seems just completely wrong to me. But I always feel torn because I don't feel like it's right for somebody to tell them, the way that you believe in God is wrong, or the way that you interpret your religion is wrong. That's a thorny thing. I wouldn't want anyone to do that to me, but of course, the MAGA Christians certainly would try to tell me that I couldn't possibly be a real true Christian because of blah, 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 whatever things they don't like about me. There's a lot. I understand. But it's the blasphemy has just gotten so out of control. I have to call it what it is. There is an idolatry happening in this country that is quite frankly terrifying. And the idolatry, the false idol that's being held up and used as a cudgel against any of the people that they consider to be in their out groups. If you're in the in group, you're fine. If you're in the out group, you're evil. And the way they can prove that you're evil is by using their false idol, the King James Bible. And it's not always the King James. It does depend on what sect you're looking at. They do have a few other interpretations that they like to use. But they believe, or claim to believe, that you can interpret the Bible literally. And if something says that, if you pick up the King James Bible and it says this, that is absolute. There's no interpretation. There's no context. And that is absolutely, hilariously stupid. I'm sorry. You cannot interpret the Bible literally. You can't. You cannot. Because you are reading it in English or some other language than what it was written in. Okay? If you are monolingual and you have not ever learned any other language, this may not be something that's intuitive to you, but languages don't always translate evenly. There are concepts in certain cultures that there's just no word for in others. That's why we have words like tsunami in our vocabulary. We didn't really have a word for that phenomenon that actually made any sense to use. We called them tidal waves, but there was nothing to do with tides. So what we did instead is we adopted a word from another language that was more accurate. And English does that a lot. There are a lot of words in English that started out in other languages, and there's a lot of words in Japanese that started out in other languages. That's kind of how language works. It's this ebb and flow, and some things just don't translate. And the meaning of words changes within a language. I think of a good example of that is Megan Thee Stallion. The way that her name is written, it's the. The means you. The, Thee, means you. So her name is Megan Thee Stallion. And I think that's cooler. But a lot of people don't know that, They just think that it's a special way of writing E. I don't know if that was her intention. I sure hope it was, because she seems smart enough to understand that. But words change. Look at the word gay. When my mom was a kid, she could go and buy cast recordings of musicals, and they would have the word gay in them, and that meant happy and frivolous and light and whatnot. And by the time I was born, you would never use it in that context, you know? The meaning of words changes. So you're talking about a book that was written in a different language, doesn't necessarily translate exactly the same into English, and written thousands of years ago at minimum, right? Well, no, not at minimum. 2,000 years ago at minimum, basically. And here we are trying to say that the English version of the Bible can be used as this absolute justification for harming other individuals. It's nonsensical. Like, I remember spending so much time in like youth group and different Bible studies where we would go through and we would discuss the actual original wording of a particular section of the book of a book of the Bible, because the Bible is a very long text. You know, it's I sincerely wonder how many evangelicals, MAGA Christians types have read the Bible all the way through. Because there's a whole lot of sections of it that are just like long genealogies and things like that. It's not exactly, you know, a page turner. There are parts of it that are more important than others. And in fact, there were additional texts that could or could not have been included when different versions of the Bible have been put together. You know, these are just the ones that we have pretty good documentation on, and it seems almost certain that they are from the correct sources. But, you know, I mean, we're talking about a game of telephone over thousands of years. They didn't have a printing press. They didn't have a computer or a typewriter or something like that. It's what people wrote out and wrote out and wrote out. People can make errors. People can decide that this wording doesn't seem quite right to them, and they decide to correct it. They can, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. And you also have to remember that we are talking about a society that has been patriarchal for most of its existence. Christianity and patriarchy are kind of best friends. Patriarchy is not something that is endemic to humanity. There are a lot of different cultures that have matriarchal or even different kinds of structures other than patriarchal or matriarchal. But the Jewish and then Roman and then European and then, you know, Catholic, all of the culture that goes along with Christianity has that patriarchal worldview. And that has colored the way people interpret the Bible. There is nothing in the Bible at all that says that Mary Magdalene was a sex worker. However, that has been a very common interpretation over different parts of the Christian experience. If you look at art from certain time frames, that is how she's depicted. The interpretation of her and her importance and who she was had connotations added to it after the fact that may or may not even be accurate. The Bible is a living document. It's not set in stone. It's not the 10 Commandments written on tablets and given to Moses. It's the books that were written by the people who were there, and they were lived in those moments, and they felt the presence of the Lord and were given this inspiration to write. But the parts of the Bible, if you want to take any parts of the Bible literally, you need to use the red letters. The red letters meaning the words of Jesus as quoted by his disciples. Those are the parts of the Bible that I take more literally than any other, because I believe that the disciples did a very careful job of transcribing what it is that Jesus's message was. And then from that point, I believe the people who continued moving that information forward through time also took great care with especially the words of Jesus. But again, humans are faulty. Humans make mistakes. Humans have biases. We are all sinners. That is why we Christians believe that we needed Jesus to die for our sins, isn't it? Because we are all imperfect. And to think that a document that was both written and then maintained over centuries by human beings could be perfect and infallible, that's blasphemy. It's false idolatry. The false idol that the extreme Christian right worships is their specific translation of the Bible, and specifically the parts of their translation that they care to look at. Because I bet you they probably don't know that Genesis has 2 separate creation stories, and that it's really not certain if they are complementary, if they're completely separate, if they are at odds or not. There are many, many different interpretations of the fact that there are 2 creation stories in Genesis. How could you think that you, a layperson who has not studied this all of your life, or even if you have studied it all of your life, how could you believe that you could come to a conclusion when this is a thousands of years old debate with lots of very, very knowledgeable people coming to different conclusions about that dichotomy? I feel like the so-called Christians on the right, a lot of them, are paying lip service to something they don't believe in, or are attempting to convince themselves that they believe in the hierarchy that puts them on top. The problem with that, of course, if you really are Christian and you really do believe, you know that God is all-knowing. You know that God knows what's in your heart. I think that's maybe part of the reason why a lot of these people need to convince themselves that their version of what they think is Christianity is the only and best way. Are you gonna pant right on my microphone? She's like, Mom, you got me in the sun. Well, let's see if I can move you so you're not as... No, I can't really. She's just like that. Okay, hang on. Sorry, everyone. My dog is adorable and I can't stand it. All right, let's see if we can get you out of the sun a little bit. Is that any better? No, not at all. Now she's just panting everywhere. Well, don't you dare. Don't you dare. None of your business. Anyway, I don't know how you could have really truly read the Bible and saw where it says things like, stop. You got the old man going too, didn't you? Say things like, you're going to hell, or God hates blah or blah, blah, blah. None of that makes any sense to me. Because they very explicitly asked Jesus. They said, Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And you know what he said? He said, love God. Love is supposed to be the very first most important thing that you're doing, is love. Not hate, not judgment. And you know what he said the second most important commandment was? He said, loving thy neighbor, everyone around us. I think people forget that the parable of the Good Samaritan is that the Good Samaritan was the outcast. He was somebody that was supposed to be hostile or amoral or suspect, and he defied those expectations. A Good Samaritan is not just someone who is kind and generous and helpful to others, but there's someone who is kind and generous and helpful to others even if the others involved are part of their oppressor class. Like, this is deep stuff. The Bible has so much information. And the way they simplify things down to you must perform the rites and rituals of Christianity, and that's what being a Christian is. I'm like really unsure how that happened. I mean, maybe it's because of Catholics having a lot of rituals, and then you get Protestants are sort of anti-ritual, and then now you have all these non-denominational people who maybe want the ritual, but they don't have it, and so they try to come up with, I don't know. It's exhausting, honestly. And I don't understand how this happened. I don't understand how these people were led so astray by this false idol, by their own belief that their interpretation, their version of the Bible is literal and absolute. I think one of the main issues is this idea of authority. I was watching Dan Olson's Mandrax video, and it talks about flood geology and young earth creationists and all of that. And he talks about how there are people who do sort of pseudoscience to prove that their version of young earth creationism is supported by scientific evidence, which of course it is not. But the reason why they would want to do that is science has a specific authority in our culture, and they want to co-opt that. They want to take the authority of a scientific fact and assign it to biblical interpretations that they have made. They want to basically launder their opinions to fact by using the aesthetics of science. And I think that's it. I think it's a power thing. It's a power thing. It's so bizarre to think that, I mean, prosperity gospel just blows my mind. I don't understand how you could be part of a church that has a pastor that lives an extravagant lifestyle. Like, the people who are the most true, the most dedicated, disciplined disciples of Christ are the kind of people who would not want to accumulate wealth. They would want to find a way to facilitate wealth being passed from those who can spare it to those who need it. I know some really, really nice people in my hometown that work really hard to put on what they call the really, really free market. And what that is what it says on the tin. It is a sort of market day. They hold it wherever they can. They have a lot of trouble finding places that are willing to let them do it. But everyone shows up and they have things that they don't need or don't want or that they've made and they'd like to give away. And it's food and furniture and clothes and toys and anything that, and people just show up and they give away whatever it is they want to give away. And if there's anything that they want, they can take it, but, they don't have to. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And that's the sort of thing churches need to be doing. They need to be helping communities come together to help each other. The church is not the building, it's not the organization. It is the people. And the church is dying in this country. It's so funny to me because it always comes back to that same cliche. Every accusation is a confession. They've been screaming about Christianity being under attack while they were the ones who were distorting and attacking it. They're the ones who have made it so unpalatable and associated it with hate and judgment and breaking up families and violence, encouraging hate and violence. Like, there are people who are extremely traumatized because of Christianity and the way that it has been distorted into this monster of false idolatry. That's the real, true threat to Christianity. And it's working. It's winning. We're losing. Every year there are less and less people who identify as Christian. It used to be an overwhelming majority in this country, and it is dropping rapidly. And why, I believe, is because churches change from being community support systems to social clubs. I knew a person who I think is a very nice person, but maybe a bit shallow. She told me, or not me directly, but I heard this through the grapevine. The reason she picked her church was because of her pastor's shoes. I can't imagine a more shallow reason for picking a church. People pick churches like they used to pick social clubs. And the funny thing about it is they don't have to discriminate. Like, outwardly they don't have to discriminate because they just make it so hostile for anyone they don't want in their little club to be there that they would never come. And they're making their little clubs more and more insular, and it's disgusting. It's disgusting. They're pushing people away from having the community that they could have through church. That's one thing that, when I had cancer, people from my church, even though I hadn't been there in like a long, long time, they stepped up and helped me out, Churches as a community organization that's out to help and be charitable, that is an amazing thing. And here we are, and we're losing that. We're absolutely losing that. I remember when I was a kid, in the summer times, there would always be vacation Bible schools. And, it was West Virginia. There's, no public transportation. And there were a lot of people who, their kids didn't really get to go anywhere at all in the summertime. The only time they ever really left the house ever was when they took the school bus to school, you know? And so there would be churches in my area that would actually do vacation Bible schools, and they would do bus service, and they would go and pick up kids and bring them there, and give them something to do and get out of the house. And I thought, okay, I'm going to have my goddaughter here for the summer. I sure would like to, be able to maybe find some of those for her. But I've never heard of any in this area. Like, that's the kind of things that churches need to be doing. They need to be helping the community. They need to be presenting Christianity as something that is actually affirming and good, because that's what it is. That's how I feel about it anyway. I'm pretty much out of time, and Kimmy is driving me crazy, so I'm going to have to figure out what's wrong with her. Sorry, guys. Love you. Talk to you later, Christians. Keep it going. God loves you. If you're atheist or not Christian, you're still cool. I have no trouble with that. I love y'all. Everyone's family as far as I'm concerned. So take care of yourself, family members. I'll talk to you later.